Avenue Radio. Hello, my name is Pastor Derek Lane, and I live and pastor here in the Othello community. I'm vaccinated because I know how illness can hurt a community. As a grandfather, I am boosted to help protect my 3.5-year-old granddaughter who can't be. I don't want to see members of my community die needlessly. And as a pastor, I've had funerals for those who caught COVID, but none from taking the vaccine. If you have questions, need resources, or want to make an appointment, visit kingcounty.gov/vaccine.
Rainier Avenue Radio presents All Music, All Day Saturday. Music, All Day Saturday.
This is Edwin Bailey, Bulldog Blues.
Jazz from the Cabinets.
That's right. It's time once again for Jazz from the Cabinets with Big Poppy.
Start Time.
Thanks for tuning in. My name is Paul Pierce. This is Start Time.
Saturdays, all music, all day. Reggae Hour, K-Fox Night.
Looking for the perfect beat? Yeah, it's the beat of the Fox.
Fresh Juice with D-Money in the crew.
Myself, D-Money.
Ice Patrol.
Taylor Hart.
This is Spencia, the Northwest Rap Gang.
DJ Medina. Chad Cheddar.
Come on.
Northwest Rap Game.
Sergio Lacour's Love Line.
It's Sergio's Love Lines with Sergio LaCour. Go to the phone line. Tell her who we talking.
Sea Monster Radio, Mo Jams. It's your jam.
We're live. Welcome to Mojo Mondays. This is KZ of KZ Music Media. Caller Goddess for Mojo Mondays.
Just my opinion. God is inspiration. Music all day and all night. Saturdays on RainierAvenueRadio.world.
This is Rainier Avenue Radio.world.
Pretty good. I mean, solstice was yesterday. I feel re-energized and had ceremony and was hanging out with, really good people.
Nice. Cool.
How about you? How are you?
I am doing A-okay. I'm so glad that the sun's back out with us today. I was getting a little sad that she was gone, so I'm glad that she's back and just in time for the solstice too. I was laughing because I feel like anyone who is like listening live, going from one show into the next, it's like such whiplash going from like, yeah, sports into, okay, now let's talk about decolonization and let's get serious with it. And so I was just laughing thinking about that. Yeah, cool.
Well, I mean, we got to balance it out too. So
yeah, we do.
We got to have fun with it.
Totally. That's what a great segue, Johnny. That's what this is all about, is having fun for this episode. So my name is Nicolette. I work for the Illahee Fund, and I'm here with my co-host.
Johnny.
We're happy to be back. This is the Wise Action Radio Show through Rainier Avenue Radio. Don't forget to donate to Rainier Avenue Radio. We are airing live today on June 22nd, and our episodes are every other Thursday. So you'll catch us live again, not next Thursday, but the Thursday after at 1:00. So today we're back into the conversation of decolonization. And
what episode are we on? What part?
Oh gosh, this is episode 4
of decolonization.
It's episode 4 of, I think, technically part 3 of decolonization, because we talked about something different on the first episode, but then we got into decolonization and just haven't been able to let it go since, I guess.
So we're deep diving.
We're deep diving, and today we're going to get into a little bit about relationships and Western style relationships versus Indigenous relationships. And what kind of relationships, you ask? Great question. All of them, ideally, we'll try to get into within our 30-minute time slot. So what are your initial thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm curious about Western relationships and your perspective there. Yeah.
Yeah, Western relationships, Western style relationships. When I think of Western style relationships, and for context, Western style, I'm thinking like um pretty much sort of like your standard nuclear suburban family style relationships, and as sort of like my grounding example, I guess. And I use that as the grounding example because I think it really sets the framework for the idea of Western relationships being very linear, very isolated, very individualized. And I kind of talked about this on our last episode, but it's something that I think is like really pervasive. And it seems like a really simple concept of like these sort of like isolated relationships. But I think that when you've got like a nuclear family style relationship as a baseline growing up the way that I did, that really influences your relationships with everything else. And that's what I mean. Like, oh, what kind of relationships are we talking about today? All of them, ideally, because the relationships that you have at a baseline are going to influence the relationships that you have going forward.
Well, when you're describing relationships and you mention isolation, it's kind of freaking me out. But
I know it's a little bit like antithetical to each other, right? Relationships and isolated, it doesn't really make sense. Which, spoiler alert, you're right. you're on the right path there. It doesn't really make sense. And take a shot every time I bring up white supremacy. It's connected to white supremacy. But basically, in what I'm sort of thinking of is you've got these sort of isolated family style, I'm thinking of like the suburbs where there's kind of no community based anything. You don't really have like a public transit system. You don't really have public centers aside from like few and far between rec centers in your churches, basically. And kind of having these like isolated, not only from other people, but also from other like beings. So you're isolated from nature, you're isolated from urban centers for community building and whatnot. And so it kind of restricts your ability to interact with other groups of people, other communities, other entities, other just ways of life, and then other ways of organizing. And so essentially you've got these sort of isolated relationships, this sort of antithetical concept of being around other people where you kind of are worried really only about your immediate people. So, your family, it's not, you don't have that sort of,
how was, I'm curious, how was that like taught, or how was that, I don't know, I want to go to indoctrination or whatnot, what's the like articulation, or what's the rationale,
I think the way that I think about it is kind of going backwards. So the perspective that I have now is I'm very involved in mutual aid and like kind of in a community organizing space. And that's how I've built a lot of my community since living in Seattle, is through community organizing and mutual aid. And mutual aid is exactly what it says that it is. It's mutual aid. So it's neighbors helping neighbors. It's if you have resources for something, providing those resources for someone who might not have them. So for example, having housed neighbors help unhoused neighbors in, whatever resources that might be. It might be sustenance and food. It might be hygiene supplies. It might be friendship, companionship, whatever it might be. And so sort of like that camaraderie, that care, that sort of collectivism, in that you're taking care of one another because that's your community and that's what you do. And that's just sort of the baseline. So walking that backwards in sort of these Western style relationships, that's not the baseline. You don't take care of the people around you because it's sort of this is me and mine. I'm going to take care of me and mine. Hopefully you can do the same. If not, that's not my problem. And if you're causing a problem, I'm going to call the homeowners association or something. Right. And in a way, I think indoctrination can apply to it, and in the sense of like, maybe not in the immediate concept of the word, but there's a reason that like the suburban model is so prominent in the US, because that sort of maintains that status quo of isolated, not organizing, not taking care of one another, not recognizing what is the common thread of what's hurting other people. And I think that's sort of the key, and the reason why this sort of like relationship structure is so prominent is because it's keeping people from recognizing what the problem is and like where that problem is coming from. And when you keep people from recognizing the problem, you keep people from addressing and solving the problem, which would be dismantling white supremacy. So that's 2 for this episode so far.
Yeah. Well, I struggled in suburbia, like staying in an apartment building and not even knowing my neighbors. And when we see each other, we don't talk, like it was isolating, and I struggled with it. Like, and I was trying to grasp as I was experiencing this, like, my gosh, like emotionally, we're not talking about it. I'm not talking about it, but I'm experiencing isolation, depression, and I'm becoming like a product of this whole social structure, which was completely different. And I don't know. There's to me, I was suffering from like mental health stuff like that I've never experienced before. So.
Yeah, it sucks. It sucks. I got lucky growing up because I ended up kind of creating a community for myself through, athletics and through friendships. I had a very strong found family, and that carried me through. But looking back, if I didn't have that, I don't know what I would have done. And then moving out to Seattle, I've gotten very lucky in where I'm living now, and that I've built a community with my neighbors, and I know my neighbors, and we do that sort of mutual aid and take care of one another when we need it. And that's not a common thing. It's part of the reason why I haven't left where I'm living, even though I could probably benefit from living in a different space, but I don't want to lose that connection with people, because I'm realizing, especially from not having it in so many ways, like the value that carries, and also how uncommon it is. You go to anybody that lives in any city. I mean, my best friend lives in New York, and the idea of knowing your neighbors to the extent that I know mine is a totally foreign concept for a lot of people in cities, So and that, I think that kind of speaks to the indoctrination side of things, of like, this is the norm. This is the status quo of not having relationships with the people that you see on a day-to-day basis and that you live around. And that includes your next door neighbors in your apartment building or in your neighborhood. And that includes your house's neighbor who's living down the street from you. Like, everyone is a part of your community, and you kind of have to recognize that sort of like collective well-being side of it. And that's just not something that's present in Western style relationships.
I'm curious how that isolationist like mentality and indoctrination kind of played out with relationship to land and water with you, like growing up.
Yeah. And I think, again, I got really lucky because the place that I lived in Florida was kind of right on the fringe of like a state park, basically. And so growing up for me, I was able to, go with some kids in my neighborhood and go and play in the woods and be outside. And I was outside all afternoon. And it was wonderful. And I had this beautiful connection. And every time that I go back to that neighborhood now, which isn't very frequent, but whenever I do, I always get this sort of like feeling of calmness and of home, of like, this is the place that I grew up. I know these trails. I know this stream. Like, I know it here. And I have such a deep love and appreciation for that. But it wasn't something that really spilled into a spiritual or cultural side of it. It was just something that genuinely, I think I got lucky to experience as a child. And once I started kind of getting older and moving through school, I started losing that connection. I wasn't able to. I was so, oversaturated with schoolwork, and I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to get these grades, I have to do this for my sports in order to go to college because I have to go to college, and like all of these things. And that sort of took this precedent, and I lost the connection to a lot of other things. But again, and I got very lucky and very privileged in where I grew up, in the sense of like, I did have access to it. If I wanted to go there, I could go to the beach if I wanted to, I could go into the woods if I wanted to. I had the choice not to, but I think that also connects to like, I don't have that sort of inherent cultural or spiritual connection. I just sort of had almost like a recreational connection in a way.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that connection. And that's really important for all of us to have. And but you named a couple of things here, a state park, one, and school, right? So that brings me to think about like the history. Were you taught about maybe the original inhabitants of that area that you were very strongly connected to?
So I'm going to say that I was a part of the Florida public education system. So no, I wasn't in any sort of like teaching of the original people of the land that we were on was kind of past tense. It was like, oh, this was, the Seminoles were here, and this was the history between like the Seminoles and the Spanish, and never really got into like, and where are they now, and what are they doing now, and like nothing, and no mention of the Timucua at all. Like it was very kind of like, oh yeah, here's this tiny tidbit of history and let's move on, which is so ironic because I grew up in Seminole County, which yeah.
I mean,
exactly. It's extremely poignant and accurate for Florida's education system, and I'm going to stick to that.
What have you learned since?
I've learned a lot since, and a lot of it I had to go and find for myself, and a lot of it I'm still learning. And I'm basically making up for years and years of not having any education as like a settler, an unwelcome settler on foreign land, and not knowing anything about that, not even knowing that that was a concept, and kind of like having to take it upon myself as basically an adult to learn about those things. And it's really difficult because those resources aren't, it's not like, the thing is that I've learned is like Seattle has so many resources that you can use, and there's so much stuff that you can fall back on. It's not really like that in Florida. There's a lot of stuff that you can find if you look for it, but it's not readily available like it is out here. And so it's been difficult for me, but it's something that I find really important. That's definitely could put more effort into it for sure. But, it's more than anyone in my education system ever did, which,
Yeah, I think the past, present, and even future culture and history of the original inhabitants of this land, we call United States now, is very important. So, if you don't mind, like at least enlightening us and me, maybe a little bit about the history of the land that you're connected there in Florida.
Yeah, so I was in Central Florida, which was kind of like on the cusp between like Timucua and Seminole territory. And I really don't know anything about the Timucua. And I went to school in Jacksonville, which was Timucua territory. And they're gone. There's no Timucua left as far as I know. And I tried to find resources on them, and I found nothing. I found one children's book, and it looked like it was sort of one of those children's books that it was like, this is not the rhetoric that you should be spreading. So I found absolutely nothing about them. And then for the Seminole people, what I sort of have learned so far was just in relation to like the Spanish, of the Seminole being sort of a new tribe at the time of like the Spanish conquest, and the fact that they were notorious for pushing back in like fighting and winning against Spanish Inquisition, basically, and eventually kind of like ceding territory, and are now located more further south in South Florida near Miami, and are, I think, one of the richest tribes, who they're a part of, oh my gosh, the Hard Rock franchise.
Oh yeah, like they own it.
Yeah, so they have a lot of income from there, which is pretty cool. And I've been trying to keep up. They've got like a little newspaper that I've been trying to read, but I've fallen off on reading that. But that's kind of the extent of my knowledge, at least that I can recall right now. Come back to me in a couple of weeks, and I'll have some more information for you.
Well, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of all of this and sort of reflecting on the isolated relationships that sort of dominate Western culture. And so I'm curious to know what your perspective is, coming from an indigenous background and like partaking in indigenous style relationships. Like, what is the difference? What are some things that you're noting of like what I'm saying versus for you? Like, how did that manifest for you growing up in present day?
Yeah, I think what I began to understand later is how we value relationships is it's wealth. That really is one of our keystones of wealth. Relationships and knowledge are one of the foundational elements of what wealth means to us. And relationships is I mean, it's holistic. It's like every part of like us, because there's a inherent interconnection that we have to everything around us and within us also. So even self is a really important aspect of it, but it's not a isolationist thing. It's a taking care of self, but it's an interconnected thing. Which I think is a little underestimated and undervalued when we think about relationships and community and having communal values, because sometimes being in service means that it can sometimes default to not taking care of ourselves. But there's a whole, I think, value. It's like one of the last things that was always said. It's like, take care of yourself. That was like the saying when we depart ways, from like family visitations or being on the phone, or it was just like, all right, take care of yourself. That was the way we salutation said goodbye. And it's always like, love you, and those types of things. And I grew up in a village, and at one point there were only 3 houses in the village that I grew up in, and so it was multi-generational. So I remember a distinct time counting like 25 people like in a house, and it was only like a 3-bedroom house. So it was just like filled up. And
the HOA would never have that.
Oh no, not anymore. But I think there's like so many benefits that came from it. Of course, it has its downside too. But growing up with like grandparents in the house, and aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters, it was just a very tight-knit family and community. And even with the other the other households, which so it was my grandfather's house, his brothers, and so on. So there was always like a like weekly, or at least a weekly invitation where somebody hosted like a dinner or a lunch. So it was a big community thing. And so it was like really valued to come around food, like the elders talk with each other. And there's always like planning, like around like we do communal fishing and hunting and ceremony. So the elders were always talking. We and I had to sit there and like listen and chat with each other, and those types of values. And like I think if that makes sense, like relationships are wealth. And I always talked about like the relationships that we have with our foods and our medicines too, which were the kind of like the most valued relationships. And when we talked about our traditional foods, which included like salmon and deer and all of the big game, and the water, and all of the plant foods and medicines, it was unique relationships. They all had names, right? And they talked about these relationships with them, that we continue to take care of these relationships with the land also, or Mother Earth, which we originate from, where we come from, and when we die, where we're going to return to. But even gathering all of these foods, say like, it's like we're taking care of these relationships that existed since our creation, and it was a very high value. So there's many like laws and ethics that come along with how we engage in those relationships.
Totally. I think the one of the key points here that I'm really focusing on is that like taking care, or that lack of taking care. And I think that's one of the big sort of like diverging I don't know, values, I guess, that's kind of different between like Western style and especially in like white suburbia versus kind of any other community that values intergenerational relationships and relationships with land, especially in indigenous communities. That sort of concept of taking care, being present versus not being present is so tangible in the way that our relationships manifest later in life with different people and with different groups of people. Because I know for me, like, again, like I got very lucky with like found family and with the community that I sort of built for myself as I moved through life. But that sort of like inherent intrinsic taking care is not present for everybody, especially in like suburbia or, somewhere where you're more isolated, right? So that definitely seems to be like a common theme here coming through.
Yeah, it's interesting. I yesterday leading some solstice facilitation and for my coaching family nationally. It made me introspect and like really think deeply about self, because I got to take care of myself to be able to be there for others, right? Especially coaching.
You don't want to pour from like an empty cup.
Yeah, and thinking about it like holistically, like and in the context of decolonization too, I was just thinking, well, when I think about that, there's so much loss. There's so much substantial loss that happened with my ancestors, right? Language, culture, land loss, like all of this, like loss, like holistically, And for me personally, there are parts of me of my identity that I do not know, and essentially going on this process to be able to rediscover these parts of me and take care of those parts of me when I learn about those parts of me. It's a whole healing process. But I got to understand that there are parts of me that need that healing. There are parts of me that I don't know. There are parts of me that there's a lot of fear based because I don't know. Say loss of language or there's hundreds of like plant foods and all of this knowledge associated with like place-based knowledge and around like plants and like land and culture and ceremony and traditional cultural properties, all of this stuff. Like there's so much that I don't know, and really thinking about, well, how do I give myself grace? How do I say, well, like it's a process. It's a self-acceptance, like the here and now of like, this is who I am. But I'm on this journey of like, say, I don't know if it's like breaking these cycles or added knowledge to me and passing that on, so it can grow through the intergenerations, because there's so much intergenerational trauma with the loss of like so much. How do I kind of reverse that whole culture knowledge shock,
Yeah. And I think that sort of grace is like not something common. Like that's not something that we value in sort of our wider spread Western society, right? Because I think that's sort of another thing that is just sort of lacking in Western society is grace, and the idea that you need to change your mind. So there's lots that we ate up a lot of time there talking about
we're
this.
Almost done now.
We're almost done.
Like 5 minutes ago.
I want to remind everyone listening that this is a Rainier Avenue Radio. This is the Wise Action Radio Show. My name is Nicolette. I'm here with my co-host, Johnny Buck.
Johnny, and make sure to donate to Rainier Action Radio. Or Rainier Avenue Radio. Sorry. But yeah, right. Donate.
Cool. Well, I'm sure that we'll probably end up picking this conversation back up next time. If anyone has any feedback for us or wants us to include anything, let us know. That'd be pretty cool. Get some listener feedback. Very nice.
We're going to keep deep diving into decolonization until we don't have to deep dive anymore. We're going to deep dive like the muskrat. So we're going to go very deep.
Nice. So cool. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We appreciate it. Again, talking about relationships.
All right, hit the music.
Bye.